Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Night the Lights Went Out. It was an ordinary evening, the kind of evening that seemed to stretch on forever under the heavy cloak of the summer night. The heat from the day still lingered in the air, and the townspeople of Millbrook were just beginning to settle in for the night. Streetlights flickered lazily on, casting long, thin shadows across the quiet town. The small houses, each with their own quirks and histories, stood like silent sentinels along the streets. But something was about to happen that would change everything. It began with a hum, a low, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated the air. At first, no one paid it much attention. The hum became louder, almost like a growl, and then just as quickly, the lights went out. All of them. Every single street lamp, every porch light, every window gleaming with the soft glow of life, vanished. It was as though the town had been plunged into a black abyss. In that moment, a silence fell over Millbrook that was deeper than the night itself. It was the kind of silence that feels unnatural, as though the very air is holding its breath. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the world had suddenly paused. Then came the whispers. From behind closed windows, through cracks in doors, voices began to stir. People were talking, asking questions, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was an edge to those whispers, an urgency that hadn't been there before. People began to emerge from their homes, stepping cautiously into the darkened streets, their eyes straining to see through the inky blackness. Among them was Claire Grayson, a young woman in her 20s who had just moved to Millbrook a few weeks ago. She was still getting used to the town's quiet rhythms, its small-town charm, and its hidden corners. Story 1. The Night the Lights Went Out. It was an ordinary evening, the kind of evening that seemed to stretch on forever under the heavy cloak of the summer night. The heat from the day still lingered in the air, and the townspeople of Millbrook were just beginning to settle in for the night. Streetlights flickered lazily on, casting long, thin shadows across the quiet town. The small houses, each with their own quirks and histories, stood like silent sentinels along the streets. But something was about to happen that would change everything. It began with a hum, a low, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated the air. At first, no one paid it much attention. The hum became louder, almost like a growl, and then, just as quickly, the lights went out. All of them. Every single street lamp, every porch light, every window gleaming with the soft glow of life, vanished. It was as though the town had been plunged into a black abyss. Tonight, however, she felt a strange unease, a sense that the familiar town she had come to know so well was not what it seemed. She stood on the porch of her new home, staring out into the darkness, her heart racing. She had never known the town to experience a power outage like this. It was too sudden, too complete. And then, as the silence deepened, she felt it. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. Claire's skin prickled, and she quickly turned her head, but there was nothing there. No figure standing in the street, no movement in the shadows, just the overwhelming blackness. A distant sound cut through the quiet, a soft thudding noise, rhythmic and steady, like footsteps moving across the ground. Claire's breath caught in her throat, and she squinted into the night. The sound seemed to be coming from further down the street, from the direction of the old cemetery at the edge of town. The footsteps grew louder, and Claire's pulse quickened. She wasn't the only one who had heard them. She could see neighbors beginning to step out of their homes, drawn by the same unsettling noise. The few street lamps that still flickered dimly cast long, distorted shadows on the ground, and the street was filled with people nervously glancing around, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. "Is anyone else hearing that?" Claire heard a voice behind her, and she turned to see her neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, standing on her porch, clutching a flashlight in her hands. Claire nodded, unable to speak. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The footsteps were growing louder, closer now, though no one could see anything in the darkness. Mrs. Whitaker's face was pale, and her hand trembled as she adjusted the flashlight. I don't like this. Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. It could just be someone from the next street over. A prank or something. But even as the words left her lips, she knew it was something more. The thudding steps were not the sound of a prank. They were heavy, purposeful, as though whatever made them was walking with intention. And the air was thick, oppressive, like something was about to happen. The first scream cut through the air, shrill and desperate, shattering the fragile calm that had settled over Millbrook. Claire's heart stopped. She turned toward the direction of the scream, but the darkness swallowed it whole. The town seemed to hold its breath for a second, and then the scream came again, this time closer, so close that Claire could feel it in her chest. The woman next door, Mrs. Carmichael, was now on her front lawn, her hand clutching her throat as if she had seen something beyond the edge of the darkness, something too terrible to comprehend. "Get inside!" Mrs. Whitaker cried, her voice now filled with panic. But Claire couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her feet frozen in place. The footsteps continued, now accompanied by something else, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the pavement. The sound sent a cold shiver down Claire's spine, and she suddenly felt very small and vulnerable, exposed in a way she never had before. And then, from the blackness ahead of them, a shape began to form. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a shadow, shifting and writhing in ways that defied logic. The air around it seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from a summer road. But there was no heat, only a cold, biting chill that seemed to draw in the warmth of the night. The figure moved closer, its shape flickering like a candle's flame in the wind, indistinct and ghostly, yet its presence felt as tangible as the earth beneath Claire's feet. The scraping sound grew louder, and the air around them seemed to darken, like the night was swallowing the world whole. A voice, low, guttural, sounded from the shape. "You shouldn't have stayed." The voice was not a human voice, but something deeper, older, something ancient that came from beyond the grave. It reverberated in the air, chilling Claire to her very core. "Get inside!" Mrs. Whitaker screamed again, but this time her voice was trembling, her hand shaking violently as she pulled Claire toward the door. Claire didn't resist. She was shaking now too, the fear gripping her so tightly that it was all she could do to keep moving. The scraping sound continued behind them as they rushed into the house. But before Claire could shut the door, the figure moved forward, faster now, as if the darkness had given it wings. There was a flash, just a brief, horrible flash of its face. It was a face twisted in agony, stretched into an eternal scream, with eyes too large for its skull, eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. The door slammed shut just in time. The house was silent for a moment, the only sound the frantic beating of Claire's heart in her chest. She didn't dare move, didn't dare even breathe too loudly. She was afraid the house would hear her, that the figure outside would find its way inside. And then came the knocking. It started slow, hesitant, like someone was trying to gain entrance. But soon the knocking grew more insistent, faster, harder. It sounded like fists pounding against the door, against the walls, as though whatever was outside was trying to break in. Claire's eyes locked on the door, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She could feel the air growing heavier again, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. She heard Mrs. Whitaker behind her, her voice whispering, it's not human, Claire. It's not." But before she could finish her sentence, the knocking stopped. An eerie, suffocating silence settled over the house. And then from the shadows, from the corners of the room, a voice spoke, cold, hollow, as if it had never been human at all. "You didn't leave. You didn't listen. Now you belong to the dark." And with that, the lights went out again. The town of Millbrook never quite recovered from that night. Those who had been outside, standing in the streets, never returned home. The houses were abandoned, left to crumble in the years that followed, the windows dark, the doors sealed shut. And the shadow, the figure that had walked the streets that night, was never seen again. But sometimes on the wind, people still hear the footsteps, the scraping, and if you listen closely enough, you can hear the voice. "You didn't leave. You didn't listen. Now you belong to the dark." As the days stretched on after that fateful night, Millbrook became a town that no one dared speak of. The lights, once a steady presence in the small community, remained extinguished. The streets were dark and silent, the homes abandoned like hollow shells. The town's once vibrant life had been replaced by a thick, oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. Those few who had managed to make it inside their homes before the darkness descended never spoke of the events in detail. They couldn't. The terror they had witnessed, the figure that moved through the shadows, the voice that whispered from the corners, was too much to bear. The words of Mrs. Whitaker still echoed in Claire's mind. It's not human. It's not. The survivors of Millbrook, those who had hidden behind locked doors and shuttered windows, were now strangers in their own town. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something had changed irrevocably. The streets they once knew so well had become alien. The houses that had once offered shelter now felt like prisons. And every night, without fail, the knocking returned. At first it was soft, just a tap here or there, as if the house itself were trying to get in. But soon, the knocking became a pounding, a violent hammering on the doors, the windows, the walls, as though the very foundations of Millbrook were being shaken to their core. The townspeople would huddle together in their homes, eyes wide with terror, but they dared not look outside. The figure they knew was still out there. Claire found herself drawn back to the town, unable to leave despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her. She didn't know why. Something was calling her back to Millbrook, something that pulled at the deepest corners of her soul, urging her to return. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it in her bones. The house she had once lived in, the house she had thought was just a normal suburban dwelling, now seemed like a place out of time, a place out of the world she knew. On a night when the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, Claire returned. The streets were empty, as they always were now. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. But as she made her way down the main road, something caught her eye. A flicker, just a brief glimmer of light from a window in the distance. It wasn't much, just a faint outline, but it was enough to make Claire's heart race. She knew, deep down, that it was a mistake to go toward it, but she couldn't help herself. The pull was too strong. She walked, step by step, toward the light. It led her to the old cemetery at the edge of town, the very place where the footsteps had first begun. The gate to the cemetery was rusted, its hinges groaning as she pushed it open. The light came from a small stone mausoleum near the back, a place that had once been nothing more than a crumbling relic of the past. But now, as Claire approached, it seemed to be alive. The light, soft and flickering, glowed from within the mausoleum. Claire felt a chill creep up her spine as she stepped closer, her hand trembling as it reached for the cold, weathered door. And then, as if on cue, the door swung open. Inside was a sight that made Claire's blood run cold. The walls of the mausoleum were lined with mirrors, cracked and shattered, their surfaces covered with a thin layer of dust. But in the center, hanging from the ceiling, was a single candle. It burned with a pale, sickly flame, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. Claire stepped inside, her feet unsteady as the darkness pressed in on her. The air was thick with the scent of old stone and something else, something familiar. It took her a moment to place it. It was the smell of the earth, of decay. It smelled like death. The mirrors on the walls seemed to bend in on themselves, warping the reflection of the candlelight in strange, distorted ways. But as Claire stared into one of them, she saw something else, something that made her gasp. There in the reflection was a figure. It was her, but it wasn't her. The face in the mirror was pale, drawn, with dark circles under its eyes. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. Claire recoiled, her heart pounding. She reached up to touch her own face, to reassure herself that she was still alive, but when her fingers met her skin, it felt wrong. The reflection did not follow her movements. It remained frozen, locked in that same scream. And then the whisper came, "You didn't leave." The voice was the same guttural, hollow sound that Claire had heard that night. The same voice that had spoken from the darkness. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the candle and the shattered mirrors. The whisper grew louder. "You didn't listen." Claire's chest tightened. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape, but she couldn't. She was trapped. The air in the mausoleum seemed to close in on her, thick and suffocating, like a vice tightening around her chest. She reached for the door, but it slammed shut before her fingers could touch the handle. And then in the mirrors, she saw them. Figures, shadowy forms, their eyes glowing with an eerie light, their shapes barely visible in the shifting reflections. They were coming closer, closing in on her. The figures were no longer just reflections. They were real. They were in the room with her. The candle's flame flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The figures were now standing in front of her, their eyes locked on hers, their mouths stretching into wide, toothless grins. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling against some unseen force. It reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, and Claire felt a surge of terror as it touched her arm. "Now you belong to the dark." And then everything went black. The following morning, the town of Millbrook was still. The lights, once flickering in the distance, remained dark. The cemetery at the edge of town was silent. The town had no answers, no explanation for what had happened to Claire. She had simply vanished. The townspeople, those few who remained, spoke in hushed tones of her disappearance, of the strange events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. But no one ever dared to speak of the night the lights went out, not in any detail. The darkness had claimed Millbrook, and it was a secret that no one wanted to confront. As for the town itself, it stood empty, its houses abandoned, its streets silent. The only thing left behind was the soft, lingering echo of footsteps in the night, and the faint whisper that could be heard if you listened close enough. You didn't leave. You didn't listen. Now you belong to the dark. And the darkness waited. Story 2, Whispers from the Basement. The house on Sycamore Street had always been an oddity, even among the other old, forgotten buildings in the neighborhood. Its windows, once vibrant, now stood cracked and weathered, their glass warped by years of neglect. The paint, peeling in great swaths, revealed the bare, rotting wood beneath. There were no signs of life, no flickering lights, no laughter from within, no scent of cooking or the sound of a television murmuring from inside. The house was silent, save for the wind that whistled through the cracks in its foundation. And then there was the basement. For years, the basement had remained locked, a forbidden space that none of the neighbors dared to speak of. Rumors swirled, stories of strange sounds at night, of shadows moving within, of whispers coming from beneath the ground. No one had ever gone down there, not since the previous owners, the Holloways, disappeared without a trace, their names now just another faded memory in the town's forgotten history. But when Maggie Riley and her young family moved into the house, she couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the house's neglect. It wasn't just the dark corners and the smell of mildew that seemed to linger in the air. No, it was something deeper, something that seemed to follow her every move, an oppressive weight that settled over her with each passing day. It was the basement. The door to it sat at the end of the narrow hallway, its heavy oak frame scarred with age, the brass handle dulled from years of disuse. Maggie had tried to open it, of course, curiosity getting the better of her. But it was locked, the key nowhere to be found. She had asked the landlord, but he had brushed her off, muttering something about old houses and their quirks. But Maggie didn't buy it. She knew there was something down there, something that had been hidden for a reason. It was the whispers that kept her up at night. At first, they were faint, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls. Maggie would wake in the middle of the night, her heart pounding in her chest, convinced that someone was speaking to her from beneath the floorboards. But there was no one there, no explanation, just the whispers. The first time it happened, she thought she was dreaming. But then it happened again, and soon it wasn't just the whispers. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that echoed from the depths of the house. Maggie would stand at the top of the stairs, her hand pressed to her mouth, trying to silence the rising panic. The sound would stop as soon as she moved toward the hallway, but the feeling, oh, the feeling, never went away. It clung to her like an invisible presence. One evening, unable to stand the tension any longer, Maggie decided to confront it. She had to know what was happening. The whispers had become too loud, too insistent, and she had to see for herself what was lurking in the basement. Her husband, Tom, was away for the weekend on a business trip, leaving Maggie with their young daughter, Emily. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. Emily had already gone to bed. the soft glow of her nightlight casting long shadows along the walls of her room. Maggie moved slowly down the hall toward the basement door, her breath shallow and uneven. She had no idea what she would find. Perhaps it was just her imagination, just the natural eeriness of an old house playing tricks on her. But no, she knew. She knew deep down that there was something more, something real, hiding in the shadows. She reached for the door, her hand trembling as it gripped the cold brass handle. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of her uncertainty pressing down on her chest. But then, with a deep breath, she twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first, musty, damp, and sour, filling her nostrils and making her gag. The basement stretched before her, dark and seemingly endless. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering glow over the cluttered space. Old furniture, boxes, and forgotten relics from the past lay strewn about in disarray, their presence adding to the suffocating sense of abandonment. But it wasn't the mess that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the feeling, the oppressive, heavy atmosphere that seemed to suffocate the air. The basement was alive with something, something that was watching her. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she stepped down onto the first stair. The creak of the wood beneath her feet echoed loudly in the silence, and she froze. She thought she heard a sound, a whisper, faint and barely audible, but there it was. It wasn't in her head. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice, a low, rasping voice that seemed to beckon her, drawing her deeper into the bowels of the house. Maggie moved forward, her feet dragging slowly down the stairs. The whispers grew louder, clearer now, though still incomprehensible. They seemed to swirl around her, coming from all directions. She could feel the weight of them, pressing in on her, wrapping around her like a heavy fog. She reached the bottom of the stairs and turned, her eyes scanning the room. The basement stretched out before her in eerie silence. There was something about the far corner, a shadow that didn't quite match the others. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if something was moving within it. And then from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was small, hunched over, and covered in shadows. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was twisted and distorted, a grotesque mockery of human features. Its eyes were wide and empty, black pits that seemed to consume all light. Its mouth opened, and Maggie could hear the words now, clear and unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." The whisper was like gravel being scraped across stone, the voice dripping with malice. Maggie froze, her heart racing in her chest as the figure took another step toward her. She could feel the heat radiating from it, an oppressive warmth that made her skin crawl. Without thinking, Maggie turned and ran. She didn't care what was behind her, didn't care if it was real or just a figment of her imagination. All that mattered was escaping the suffocating darkness, the whispering voice, the feeling that something was lurking, waiting. She reached the stairs, her legs shaking as she stumbled up them. The basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and the whispers abruptly ceased. But even as she stood at the top of the stairs, gasping for breath, Maggie knew that the whispers hadn't gone. They were still there, lurking beneath the house, waiting for the next person to listen. And as she glanced back down the hallway, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The basement door, which had been shut so tightly before, was now ajar once more, the darkness within calling to her, beckoning her back. And the whispers began again. Maggie stood frozen in the dim light of the hallway, her hand still pressed against the wall, as the faint sound of whispering seeped from the open basement door. The whispers, now clearer, seemed to be speaking her name, softly, insistently, pulling her toward the darkness below. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, to flee. She had already seen enough, felt enough to know that whatever lurked in that basement was not of this world. But her body betrayed her, taking a step forward, drawn to the open door as though it were some kind of magnet. She reached the threshold of the basement door and hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The air was thick, heavy with something ancient and malignant. She could feel the pulse of the darkness below, like a heartbeat, a slow, steady rhythm that vibrated through her bones. The whispering voice, now an indistinct murmur, was rising, echoing through the house, and then, from deep within the shadows, a figure moved. It was a shape, more of a blur than anything definable, but it was coming closer. Maggie's pulse quickened, her feet unwilling to retreat. She took another step, this time through the door, her hand reaching out to grip the cold brass handle of the basement light. The bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. The whispers, now a cacophony, filled her mind. They weren't just words anymore. They were memories, fragments of forgotten lives, voices of those who had once lived in the house, voices of people who had never left. They all seemed to blend together into a single, overpowering chorus. "Leave!" The voice rasped, as if speaking directly into her ear. "You shouldn't have come back." Maggie's heart pounded wildly in her chest as her eyes searched the basement. Her gaze fell upon something, or rather someone, standing in the farthest corner, just beyond the reach of the dim light. It was a woman, or at least she looked like one. Her figure was draped in a long, dark gown, the fabric torn and tattered, her hair hanging in matted clumps around her face. Her eyes were wide, hollowed out, her skin ashen, with streaks of dirt and blood staining the once pale surface. And her mouth was moving, but the sound wasn't a voice. It was a low, guttural growl, a rasping sound like nails scraping against metal. Maggie's stomach churned with a sense of dread. Her legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the floor. She wanted to scream, to turn and run, but the sight of the woman, the thing in the corner, held her captive. "I've been waiting for you," the figure croaked, the voice like a death rattle. "You shouldn't have unlocked the door." The shadows behind the woman shifted, revealing more figures, dozens of them, all standing motionless, their faces obscured by darkness, their eyes gleaming with hunger. They were not human, not anymore. Maggie knew that with a certainty that filled her veins with ice. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her mouth felt dry, like cotton, and her throat was tight with fear. She took a step back, but the figures didn't move. Instead, they all seemed to turn in unison, their collective gaze fixed on her. And then, with a sudden and terrifying clarity, Maggie realized what they were. They weren't spirits. They weren't ghosts or figments of her imagination. They were the souls of the house, trapped in the darkness for eternity, bound to its walls, to its floorboards, to the shadows in the corners. They had all been waiting for someone to come, someone who would open the door, someone who would hear the whispers and give in to them. The ground beneath Maggie's feet seemed to tremble as the shadows crept closer, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. "You opened the door," they repeated in unison. "Now you belong to us." Maggie's heart raced. The air around her grew thick, suffocating, and she struggled to take a breath. Her head spun, her vision blurred. The walls of the basement seemed to stretch and bend, as if the room itself were alive, alive with hunger, with need. Her feet moved on their own, dragging her deeper into the basement. The figures didn't touch her, but their presence, cold, dark, suffocating, pushed against her chest. Every whisper that brushed against her ears felt like a knife twisting deeper into her soul. She tried to scream again, but the air was thick, the sound caught in her throat. The woman in the corner stepped forward, her face now clearly visible, her eyes wide and black, her lips curled into a twisted grin. "You cannot leave," the woman rasped. "None of us ever do." With a force that seemed to come from nowhere, Maggie pushed forward, stumbling toward the stairs, desperate to get out, desperate to flee. But as she reached the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The light above flickered, casting long shadows across her face. She was trapped. The whispers surrounded her, each voice more desperate than the last, their words blending into one unholy plea. "Leave," they hissed. "Leave before it's too late." But it was already too late. Maggie's breath came in shallow gasps, and as her hand pressed against the door, she felt a coldness, icy fingers brushing against her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face the basement, her eyes wide with terror. The woman, the thing, was there, standing at the top of the stairs now, and in her hand she held a candle that flickered with an unnatural pale light, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "I told you," the woman whispered, her voice like a razor. "You opened the door, and then the darkness swallowed her whole." The house on Sycamore Street stood empty once more, the whispers silenced, at least for now. The basement door was locked tight, the house as still as it had always been. No one would ever know what happened to Maggie, what she had discovered in the darkness beneath that house. And the house, well, it would wait again, as it had waited for so long, for the next person who might hear the whispers. And when they did, it would pull them down into the dark, where they would never escape. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting, just for you.